The next section that we're going to talk about is textures. First, let's talk about some miscellaneous texture workflows. If you look at my scene here, what I've got is a plane with a shader assigned to it, and this is what it looks like when it's rendered. Now, if I go into the Place 2D texture here, and I change the coverage of the texture map on the surface, so let's just go ahead and do that. So I'm moving it over, or excuse me, squishing it down. Actually, that's a bit much. Let's make that 0.5. Okay, so I've changed my coverage, and I'm just going to move it over and up. Okay, so that's now what the texture looks like. And if we do a render, you'll notice that around the edges where the texture map is not, we're getting this kind of washed out pink color. Okay, and that's because this area here is gray. Now this area here is known as the default color, and when your coverage is less than 1, you're going to have to be aware of this. Okay, so you'll have to go in, and in this instance, make it black. Okay, so that it's picking up the proper color of pink. Okay, see how that's not washed out anymore. Next thing that I want to talk about is a projection. So I'm just going to get a file here. Okay, and all we have here is a dolphin, and I've got a texture map projected onto him. So if we just move back in and do a render, okay, you notice that what I've got is a ramp, a circular ramp, and I've just got the ramp projected using this projection box as a placement, projecting up to the belly. Now, if we grab the shading network here, have a look at it, this is a projection icon here, and in this projection icon, or on the node, just under Effects, there's something that's on by default, and that's the wrap function. Now, if we go ahead and render this, you notice that what it does is it wraps my ramp all over the dolphin. Okay, so I don't want that. Just something to be aware of, and just turn that off. The next thing that we're going to talk about is MIPMAP file filtering. Now you have a movie that's included with your CD. It's called NoFilter.QuickTimeMovie. And when you play it, pay special attention to what's happening with the texture map at the back of the plane. So I'm just going to open up a file here. So when you play it, you'll notice that the texture map is actually shimmering or changing, which is not an effect that's really desirable. So let's go ahead and, whoops, let's just graph what's on there. So what I've done here is I've taken a plane, I'm looking at it at an oblique angle, and I've assigned the desert floor texture that's in that movie to this plane. So if we just do a render here, okay, so I'm just going to save this render and just go into the file texture itself, okay, and just point out under File Attributes, there's something called File Type MIPMAP. So this is on by default, and all file textures are filtered by default. And what filtering does is it improves the overall quality and the speed of the final rendered image. Now, if we go to an image here, okay, so if we go to an image here, you'll notice that what it is it's a repeated checker floor texture. And pretend like an area up here is a pixel. Okay, so we're rendering a pixel here. We need to know what color that pixel is going to be. And one of the ways that we figure out what color that pixel is going to be, keeping in mind that a pixel can only be one color, is we sample. So we sample in the pixel to figure out the color. Now, up when we're close here, we want to be really accurate about what color that pixel is, because it's very close to the camera, very close to the viewer. Back here, we don't really need to be very accurate at what color that pixel is. So sampling this like crazy, a pixel back here like crazy, doesn't make much sense. Okay, so this is very inefficient. So with regards to the MIPMAP file structure, what happens is it takes your texture map or your file texture, and it stores multiple resolutions of that file texture. So let's just go to another diagram here. Okay, so let's say our texture map is 512 pixels. So this would be the lower resolutions that is stored by Maya. And for instance, 4 pixels in this high res map might be only 1 pixel in this lower res map. So what happens is Maya chooses which level of the MIPMAP to use based on screen coverage and angle. So let's just go back to that diagram again. So we want to use something in the high res area for this texture map that's close to us because we want to be really accurate. And what we're going to do is we're going to use something in the low res map where we don't want it to be accurate. The other thing is too, is you don't want to be super accurate with these pixels that we're rendering back here, because if you do that, then you run the greater chance of the pixel changing color from frame to frame. So if the camera's animated, the pixels might be changing from black and white back here because we're being too accurate. So we don't want that. So back here we're probably going to be using just a lower level of the mipmap. So we're almost getting like a blurring effect, and that actually helps stop that shimmering or that chattering look. Okay, so mipmap is important two ways. Again, just because of the overall quality, it gets rid of the chattering or the shimmering, and also the speed too. So it's a lot quicker for Maya to grab a low-res version of this texture map and use that than sample like crazy and be super accurate about what color that pixel is going to be back here. So let's just go back to Maya. So this is what the texture map looks like with the mipmap filtering on. So I'm just going to save that, and let's just turn it off and see what the difference is. Okay, so we can already see that. Notice back here, it's a lot blurrier than here. Okay, so if we had the filtering off for here and the camera was animated, this would probably chatter back here. Okay, and we're still keeping nice definition up here though. Okay, now we can adjust which level of the mipmap Maya is going to use by going into the effects under the file itself. And there's something called filter and filter offset. So let's just turn mipmap back on here. So with the filter value, when we start lowering the filter value, we're going to be using a higher resolution in the mipmap structure. Okay, so if we just maybe do something like that, I'm just going to get rid of that image. Actually, let's say we get rid of that. Okay, so this is the original mipmap render, and if we just move to the new render, you'll notice it's a lot more pixelated back here because we are using a higher resolution in that mipmap. So we can just change that back to 1. And then the filter offset is going to have the exact opposite effect. Let's use a small value like 0.05, okay, and do a render. So you'll notice that obviously we are using a lower resolution in that mipmap structure, and the other thing is that it's blurring the entire texture, not just in the background or this back area here, but rather all over. So that's just something to be aware of. The next thing that we're going to talk about is block ordered textures. And I'm just going to get a new scene here. And I'm just going to open up the Hypershade window. Okay, so we're looking at the work area here. And I'm just going to create a Lambert shader. Okay, now when we render, everything is loaded into RAM. Now when I say everything is loaded into RAM, I mean like texture maps, scripts, scene files, everything. So that's loaded up into RAM. So sometimes we can actually run out of RAM and start to use swap, which is actually quite slow to use. So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid swapping. And sometimes you can even crash. So you might get a memory exception or something like that. So we have something called block ordered textures, or sometimes they're referred to as BOT files. And what they do is instead of the renderer keeping whole textures in RAM during the render phase, it actually uses tiles of the texture called BOT files, and it holds these tiles in a small cache in RAM. So when Maya needs a bit of that texture, it goes to disk and it gets it and it puts it in the cache. So let's just look at how we create BOT files. So again, file texture, file, and let's just grab that one there. Let's graph that so it's nice. So if you look under the file attributes, if you turn on use cache, that will change that particular texture into a BOT file. Okay, so again, a small cache in RAM, and then it tiles the texture, and then it just saves the rest of the texture onto disk, or the tiles of it onto disk, and then when it needs a bit, it just goes and gets it. Now this is not necessarily going to speed up your render, but it will prevent It can prevent crashing, and it's a lot faster to do than using swap. So this is one way of doing it, turning on the use cache flag. Now what will happen is when you do turn on that flag, when Maya goes to render this, it will automatically change this into a bot file and store it in the temp directory and then delete it when it's finished with the render. Okay, so it makes the files and then deletes them. Now if you want to have control over where the bot file is placed, so let's say for instance your temp directory, the drive that your temp directory is on is full, you can actually create the bot files yourself. And you use a command called makebot. So if we just go down here, makebot -i for the image that we're going to change, so border old red.tiff, and then the new output file name. So let's call this new border, and I'm just going to add a .bot extension to it, and then just execute that script. If we go up to the script editor, see it says result. It's placed the new bot file just under my current project directory. So once you've created that bot file, then you'll need to come in and actually point to that bot file. Incidentally, you should turn that off, okay, because we're making the bot files ourselves. So let's go grab that bot file. It's just up one level. There we go. Okay, so with this method, you will actually have to go in and delete them yourself. So Maya's not, at the end of the render, Maya's not going to delete these bot files by itself. You're going to have to go in and do that. When we looked at the texture considerations for animation with regards to the Maya renderer, we looked at problems that we could encounter when using procedural or 3D textures. And the two options for, two of the options for fixing that problem were the texture reference objects or the convert to file texture. Now with regards to the texture reference objects, these are supported in Mental Ray for Maya. Now with regards to the convert to file texture, you'll notice under the menu set that Maya software is in brackets here. So in order to bake texture information with Mental Ray for Maya, what we're going to need to do is do a batch bake. So what we're going to do is, what I've got here is just a cube, and I've assigned a marble 3D texture to it. And if we wanted to bake this using Mental Ray for Maya, what we're going to do is just select the object. So I'm just going to select it from its top node here. And under the rendering menu set, under lighting shading, we can go to batch bake Mental Ray. Just open up the option box. So objects to bake, we can use selected or all objects. We can bake things like textures or verts. So what I'm just going to do is a convert and close. Now this is basically a Mental Ray for Maya only way of baking multiple objects in a scene. With Maya's convert object, you had to shift select the shader, link to the geometry, and then bake. Then you had to sort of repeat this option for everything else, for all the other surfaces. So what's going to happen is the same kind of thing. We're going to get 6 2D textures from this. And then what we can do is we can go up and we can use something called bake sets. So we'll just wait for that to finish. Okay, and so there's our 6 new textures. So with regards to the bake sets, what we can do is we can assign a new bake set. And if we look at the attribute editor, we have a number of different attributes at this point. So what it does is it allows users to bake a variety of objects with different baking options, I should say. So you can then save these out and then use the assign existing bake set, which would be this one here, to bake other objects. So you can actually set up a parameter or parameters that you want to bake an object at, and then use those same parameters later to bake other objects with. Now with regards to displacement mapping, you set them up the same way as you would in Maya. So with Mental Ray for Maya, it's the same setup. And Mental Ray for Maya will actually use the same sort of tessellation settings, unless you go to the approximation editor and you override those displacement settings. So just really quickly, under Window, Rendering Editors, Mental Ray, there's something called the approximation editor. So if this were a displaced surface, I most likely would want to use a displacement approximation. So what I would do is just create that. And then I would have a number of different attributes that I could use to place triangles on the displaced surface. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. File texture filtering. Just going to select one of these file textures. Now, when we looked at Maya, we looked extensively at the MipMap file texture filtering and how it solved for a jittering or a chattering effect on certain texture maps, depending on the camera angle. And then we looked at quadratic being the default for Maya. Now with Mental Ray for Maya, really the only two options that are available as filter types are MipMap and off. Okay, so either there's no filtering or MipMap. And there is no pre-filtering option as well. So pre-filtering is not supported in Mental Ray for Maya. One other miscellaneous piece of information with regards to texture mapping is we have an option in Maya. It's going to go to the hypergraph here and just select one of the NURB surfaces to fix bad parameterization texture maps. So what happens is if you have a surface and it hasn't been correctly parameterized, so the isoparms, maybe you have a bunch of them all together and then some of them are further apart. What happens is when you place a texture map on that, the texture might be a little bit off in certain areas. You know, it'll look really squished in one area and really stretched out in another area. So with Maya, what we can do is we can turn on this fixed texture warp. And what it does is basically ignore the parameterization and just place the texture kind of evenly all over that NURB surface. But I just wanted to let you know that this option, this fixed texture warp option, is not supported in Mental Ray for Maya.
So new with version 6, we have a new node called the PSD node. And this new PSD node allows the use of Photoshop PSD files directly inside a Maya shading network. This allows compositing control inside Maya based on Photoshop layer sets and alpha information. The workflow for using the new PSD node is quite simple, and I'm just going to take you through that. I've got a simple scene set up here. The attribute editor for the PSD node actually is very similar to a Maya file node. We have these two attributes here that allow us to control the compositing of the layers inside Maya. So I'm just going to turn on shading and hardware texturing. We can see that we've got some alpha information here that's being used by the compositing control over here. I can go over and I can change how the layers are being composited and which alpha to use, like so. So I'm just going to delete that and just show you how to bring in the PSD node. Just select the material node and hit that map button, go into the create render node window and go down to the PSD file, click on that, and the PSD node is created with a place 2D texture node here, just like in a regular Maya file node. And notice just down in this section here that the link to layer set and alpha to use attributes are grayed out. It's not until we bring in the actual Photoshop PSD file that this functionality becomes enabled. So let's do that. Let's hit on the Browse button and bring in a Photoshop PSD file. And notice now that these two attributes are no longer grayed out. So now at this point we can go in and change the compositing accordingly.